You've studied the design process at this point. Now, how do you create an effective design? And you do that simply by understanding the fundamental or primary principles of design. And that's what we're basically going to talk about. We've talked about how you go through the design process, the importance of the design process. Now it's time to talk about what you do when you sit down at your desk with your paper and start sketching. How do you create an effective design that meets your client's specifications? How do you create an effective design that solves their design problem? You do it through using the primary principles of design. Those primary principles being unity, variety, hierarchy, dominance, proportion, and balance. Now we're going to talk about each of these primary principles individually. Unity. Unity in design exists when all elements are in agreement. Really, unity anywhere exists when all people or elements are in agreement, if you think about it. But unity is important to design because when someone looks at your design, or when someone looks at any design, they shouldn't see the design for its parts. They should see the design as a design of something whole, or the whole design. They shouldn't notice the colors. They shouldn't notice that you use certain types of typeface. They shouldn't notice that you used a certain photograph. They should see the design as it is in its wholeness, and that's where unity comes in. If they look at the design and only see pieces and parts, they don't get the message. Now you can create unity in a design when the elements used have a visual similarity. For example, they're aligned or they're next to one another. The elements used have a conceptual similarity. They're all things to do with food, things you see at a fair, things that you see in an airport, things that you see at home, things you see at school, things you see in your car, things you see when you're on the highway. When you employ repetition to create unity and rhythm, for instance, you repeat size of certain elements, color, shape, position, or maybe texture throughout a design. But you have to be careful with these. You have to be careful with all of these different elements that you can use or tools you can use to create unity. Because if you use too much, your design can become somewhat dull. If you use too little, it can be chaotic. Now, as far as creating unity in your design, proximity is the easiest way to achieve this unity. Objects or elements that are physically close together are automatically seen as related. Think about yourself at a party. If you see a guy there by the name of Jack, and you see a woman there or a girl there by the name of Susan, if Jack is in one corner of the room and Susan is in the other, you don't assume that they're there at the party together. Now, you might know that they're there together because that with previous knowledge, but if you were to walk into the party and be introduced to Jack and be introduced to Susan, if they were standing in separate corners of a room at a party, you would never know that they were there together. However, if you were introduced to Jack and Susan and they were standing right next to one another, touching almost, or just within inches of touching, you would assume that they were there together, or at least that they were good friends, right? Well, design's the same way. If you see two elements in a design that are closer together than anything else in the design, you would assume, or you will assume, that they belong together. This is an example. Do these boxes seem or look like they belong together, or do they look like different elements displayed in a defined space? So you look at this, and you see that they're all boxes, right? So we know that in one of the rules of creating unity, you can use similarity. So you could argue that these are all rectangles and they're all shades of gray. So you kind of have some unity there. But looking at them on this page, does it look like they belong together? Does it look like this black box belongs with this gray box, or this large gray box belongs with this medium gray box? Well, you could argue yes, you could argue no, but you're not really sure. And in design, you have to instantly communicate what you're trying to communicate, because you only have a split second to capture the attention of someone, and you only have a few minutes, if you're lucky, that they will look at your design and interpret the message that you're trying to send. Now look at these same boxes and see how they're arranged differently. You see that they're all close to one another. They all have just this sliver of space between them. So now there's no question in your mind that all of these boxes belong together. They all look like they belong together with the same story or the same design or the same message. So that's how you use proximity to create unity. In this magazine advertisement, you can see that the designer created unity in the design by utilizing alignment, proximity, conceptual similarity, and repetition. So they're all aligned. They're all on a row. They all sit on the same baseline. Proximity, they're all smack dab next to each other. So you know that at least in each of these rows that these photographs belong together. Conceptual similarity, they all have to do with travel. Each one of these photographs has to do with travel. You have a bus, you have a map, you have gates at a terminal, you have arrows pointing you to a different thing, you have movement of a train whizzing by, metro, you have a hall in a travel area, you see the clouds over or under a plane wing. These are photographs that all have to do with travel. So this advertisement, Wanderlust Travel Journal, if you just glance at it and you don't read it, you know that this advertisement has something to do with travel. And then of course you also have repetition. All the photographs are the same size. All the photographs appear in this rhythm here where you've got 3 photographs, then 3 photographs, then 3 photographs, and 3 photographs, and 3 photographs, which by the way adheres to the rule of 3, which you will see is the underlying underpinnings of good design. We just have a thing about things in 3s. But through this, everything looks like it belongs together. In this ad, the designer created unity by what? Again, the conceptual unity or the conceptual quality, it all has to do with food. You have visual similarity as far as each one of these photographs is the same size. They all pretty much have even the same type of color. You have proximity. They're all next to one another. In fact, they're touching. And you have alignment. They're all aligned. You also have repetition. You've got 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then 1. So as you can see, again, everything in this advertisement looks like it belongs together. And even though we can't read what it says, we know it has something to do with food on a tray. Interesting, huh? You can also use repetition to achieve unity, like we've seen in the previous 2 examples. And you can create repetition through size, color, shape, position, or texture. So think about repetition. Look at these objects. Again, it's another exercise. Do they look like they belong together? Other than the fact that they are all within the same given space and that they're all shapes, you really can't say that they belong together. How about now? This is a way of achieving unity through repetition. They're all, you have them repeated. You've got boom, 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 boom. You have them all the same size. You also have them aligned, and you also have that proximity. So they're repeated. You see this kind of rhythm in the repetition. So it looks more like they belong together, and you have more unity. How did we establish unity in this one? You can say we established unity through color. They're all shades of blue. They're different sizes, and they're somewhat arranged, but the thing that really ties them all together is they're all shades of blue. Now how about this one? Well, they're all the same shape. We've taken their individual shapes and made them all rectangles. So while they're different colors and different sizes, and they're really not aligned that much or within proximity of one another, they are all at least rectangles with black lines around them. In this example, we are achieving unity, through alignment. And also a proximity. They're all lined up on this one line, and they're all right smack dab next to one another. So this one has no repetition or unity. This is repetition and unity through position, repetition and unity through position and size, repetition and unity through color, and repetition and unity through shape. More unity through repetition. You can also use rules, which I don't mean by rules as in you can't break these. I mean rules as in lines, background tints, and boxes. Position, size, color, shape, and rules were all used to create unity through repetition in this brochure. So you could see positioning. you can see that these are all lined up with one another, again, in groups of 3, which is the rule of 3s. Size-wise, you see that each of these boxes of text is the same size, also down here, which is on the inside of this brochure. You see even here that the length of text is very similar in size. You also see a similarity in size. Actually, it's an exact same size in all the headers. And again, similarity in size down here, even up to this page. You see a similarity in size in the illustration on both pages. You see a similarity in size of the lines and the rules that they used. Shape also is repeated throughout this brochure. You have box shapes created through the text. And then you also have these line shapes used throughout the brochure. And through this, you are able to see unity throughout this brochure. If you saw the cover of this brochure or the inside, even if you just opened it up, you would know that each page was designed to go with each other. So you have a unity or a wholeness in the design. In this brochure, position, size, shape, and a rule was also used to create a unity. So you have position. You have all of this lined up. You have all these photographs of vegetables and fruits lined up. And here you have not really position other than everything is centered with the exception of the trees, and you could even argue that the trees are centered. Size, all of these photographs are similar in size. There's not one that's extremely larger than the other, but they're all within the same general size. Up here, each of these is pretty much the same size in that you have them all situated on a rule. And then you also have the use of a rule to create emphasis and repetition in here. And then you also have shape. Everything's a square, as you can see. Each one of these photographs at the bottom is a square. This is a square. This rule creates a square. So again, and you even have the little square here, which is the hole in the brochure that you look through to see the fields. So that's how they've created unity in this brochure. How about this one? What did the designer use to create unity through repetition? Well, circles, colors, alignment, position, proximity. So again, you can see the use of repetition to create unity throughout a design. Because you got to remember, a design isn't necessarily just one page or just one page on the website. Designs can be multiple pages. But even within one page, you want to establish unity so that you have that wholeness in your design. Variety is necessary to create visual interest. Combining objects or elements that appear to be different but are actually similar in some way helps to create that interest. So while we're always trying to create unity in our designs, we also need to try to create variety. So you remember this brochure? Can you see how the designer used variety to create visual interest? You have a photograph of an orchard and a sky. When you open it up, you still have a photograph of a sky, but now we have a different scene. Rather than an orchard, we're looking at a photograph of agricultural fields. And down in these photographs, you see that they're all photographs of produce, things that are grown or produced on farms, because we're looking at fields and we're looking at an orchard. But if you look at all these, you see we have fruits and vegetables with the exception of one, and that being cotton. This is variety to add visual interest. And it's important so that your design doesn't become too static or uninteresting. Hierarchy and dominance are another element or principle of design that is very, very necessary. Hierarchy is the established order of importance in a design. It's all about eye flow and about directing the viewer through the design. Remember, design is a business of communication. And in order to communicate your message, you have to make sure that you direct the eye of the viewer as to where they can look to get the message. You first of all, you bring them in with a focal point or with something, some eye-catching item or element that brings them into the design. And then once you get them in, you got to keep them in and you got to tell them where to look next. Otherwise, you'll lose them and they won't get your message. So we do this through hierarchy and dominance. Hierarchy is best expressed through proximity, grouping less important things together and putting one thing apart. Similarity, making less important elements similar and the most important elements significantly different. So the important part of this magazine page is the article on the sandwich. Do you see how the article is grouped with the photo the most visually dominant element, and the title, the next most dominant element. If you look at this page from a magazine, the first thing you're going to notice, the focal point, the thing that has the highest visual hierarchy is the photograph. And the reason we notice the photograph is contrast. It's the only photograph on the page. We notice the photograph, we see that it's a tasty looking sandwich. Now this is a food magazine, so food obviously is going to attract the attention of the viewer. And the next thing that we look at is the headline of Rich Little Po' Boy. And this is the headline of the article, and then you have a subhead that's in italics underneath. This is a New Orleans sandwich of mythical proportions. At which point the P, or the versal, will bring you into the article that you'll read. You notice that all of this is grouped together, and that the recipe is visually separated by a box. The reason being is the most important part of the article, what the designer is telling you who laid out this page, is the sandwich and the story that goes along with it. The next most important is the recipe, just in case you want to make it. You got to talk about the sandwich, you got to talk about the history of the sandwich, you got to talk about the foodiness of the sandwich, because this is a food magazine that I got this from. And then you give them the recipe. The next principle we're going to talk about is proportion. The size relationships within a design or composition. However, the outer dimensions of the composition determine the format of a design and are its most basic proportion. So when we're talking about proportions, we're not just talking about the elements on a page or on the screen. We're also talking about the size that the composition is created in, or the size that the design is laid out in. For instance, it could be an 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper, or it could be a screen on a television, or a screen on a monitor as in a computer. With proportion, one of the first decisions you will make when solving a design problem is the composition's overall dimensions and format. So if you're not designing in a space that is defined and cannot be changed, such as a computer monitor, because you've got the aspect ratio that you have to work in, or a television, you've got an aspect ratio. If you're designing for print, you're going to have choices sometimes in which you'll determine the overall dimensions of your format. This will determine the internal relationships of the design components, so you must be careful. In other words, do you want something that's tall and vertical, or do you want something that's wide and horizontal, or do you want something that's a perfect square, or maybe a circle? The shape of the design format also has an associative meaning. The associative meanings of formats. This is what we're taught in the Western world. Now, I'm not talking about different countries right now. I'm talking about the Western culture. A vertical rectangle in the Western culture is associated with architectural metaphors such as a building, a window, or a door. It can also relate to the standing human form. Magazines, books, and print ads, and most poster designs utilize this format. Think about it. That's what you see a poster design. Generally, it's taller than it is wide. If you see a poster that's wider than it is tall, generally that's an anomaly. A horizontal rectangle is associated with a landscape. Today, movie screens, computer monitors, and televisions utilize this format. A square format offers a stable, neutral format. It is at times difficult to design and is difficult to design with, as it doesn't allow the use of the golden rectangle. And we're going to talk about the golden rectangle in a minute. But that's the basic of design. The square format offers this stable, neutral format, so it can be boring. So you have to be careful with the square format, because basically your designs just become very circular in nature when you're using a square format. Now, as far as the golden rectangle has been around since the Greeks, forever, and it's based on the ratio of the golden mean, the same ratio found in the structure of plants and other life forms. In other words, it's a structure or a ratio that we're comfortable with. It's a ratio that we are ingrained with. It's our world around us as far as natural life and other life forms. This golden rectangle was used by the Greeks for the basis of much of their architecture. Today's graphic designers often use it to create harmony and balance. Again, humans seek out something that they're familiar with when they're looking at things, when they're looking at designs. They're looking for that familiarity. They're looking for something they recognize, because as human beings, we want to organize what we see. Because if you think about it, we try to organize the chaos that is all of the input of all the visual stimuli, the auditory stimuli, the touch, the sensation stimuli. We're always trying to organize it into something that we can understand. And the golden rectangle helps with this. Now, I have the rules of the golden rectangle and how you can construct a golden rectangle by starting with a square. Find the center of the square by drawing intersecting lines through opposite corners as shown in the gray X. From there, draw a vertical line through the intersecting point of the X. Now, I'm not going to go over this at length because it would make this presentation hugely long, but do know that I have it in this presentation and it's also outlined in your book. And it's something that you should look at and look for in design, and we'll touch upon it later. Another principle of design that's very important is balance. It's the visual distribution of elements in a composition or a state of equalized tension. Again, humans seek things they're familiar with, things that they're comfortable with, and balance is one of them. We depend upon balance because without balance, we couldn't stand upright. So when we look at designs, we look to see that they're balanced. If they're not balanced, it puts a question in our minds. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have unbalanced designs to create this visual interest or tension, but you're most generally going to want to have a balanced design. Otherwise, people will think, something's missing, or there's been a mistake. Now, there's two types of balance when you're talking about design, asymmetrical and symmetrical. Symmetrical designs or symmetrical balance is referred to often as formal balance. It's vertically centered and visually equivalent on both sides. Symmetrical designs are static and evoke feelings of classicism, formality, and constancy. Now, the best way to remember if it's a symmetrical design is if you folded the design in half on its axis, whether that axis was either vertical or horizontal, both sides would match. It's kind of like a mirror image. They can be a little bit different and it can still be a symmetrical design. But basically, if you took both halves and folded them, they would match. Or if you took both sides and looked at them, they would visually be very equal. Asymmetrical designs, or asymmetrical balance, on the other hand, is an informal balance. It attracts attention and is dynamic. It is not visually equivalent on both sides. It evokes feelings of modernism, forcefulness, and vitality. Asymmetrical designs are the ones that are very interesting. They're automatically interesting because generally they're not really truly balanced, but they are balanced based on a visual tension or an implied balance. This is a symmetrical design, again using my famous boxes. As you can see, everything is centered on the page. This is centered, these two are centered, and this is centered. It's a symmetrical design. This is an asymmetrical design. This is off to the left. These two lines are off to the right, and these are centered. But because this is off to the left and this is off to the right, we have an asymmetrical design. If you folded this design in half along its vertical axis, the sides would not match. However, because you have this off to the left, this much, and these two heavy black lines off to the right, you get a visual tension that creates a balance. This is an example of more symmetrical designs. Centered text. Centered text is automatically symmetrical. This photograph is somewhat symmetrical. You have three figures, and it's a little off. You could argue that it's slightly asymmetrical, but overall it's a symmetrical design or a symmetrical photograph. Symmetrical in the layout of this text and symmetrical in the layout of this photograph. This is a symmetrical poster. It's a ship. It's a view of a ship, and it's dead center right in the photograph, and they've centered the text here, the word both trade, and up here. This is symmetrical and asymmetrical, this design here. This is somewhat symmetrical, kinda. You could also argue that it's asymmetrical because of this pink box that kind of throws the symmetry off. This is asymmetrical because the one, while it is centered, the box next to it is off to the right. This is symmetrical and asymmetrical as well because these two boxes, you could argue, give it an asymmetry, but everything is centered. And of course, this design here, or this page, is asymmetrical. This is an asymmetrical design of bunnies. The bunnies are all over the place. Now, there's a pattern and a method to this madness, if you think about it, and I'll talk about eye flow here real quick. You see this big bunny? this is the bunny you're going to be attracted to when you look at this page. If you look at this big bunny, all the other bunnies are laid out to bring your eye around to the wording on this page or in this poster, which is advertising an event. But the bunnies are laid out indiscriminately. There is a plan to them and a method to the madness, like I said, but it's not exact. If you folded this in half on the vertical axis, it would not be even, it wouldn't be a mirror image, and if you folded it on its horizontal axis, it would not be even. So in summary, knowing and using the principles and elements of good design will provide a solid foundation for you to build upon in becoming a graphic designer. You have to know these principles. You have to understand these principles and how to apply them, because all of these principles and elements will help you begin to become a great graphic designer. If you have these principles in place, your design overall would be a good, strong, solid design. It doesn't have to be phenomenal. Just starting out, you don't have to have phenomenal designs. But if you have good, solid principles backing up your designs, they're going to cut the mustard. They're going to make the grade. Sorry to be so trite. Anyway, I hope you have a great evening or afternoon, and I'll see you again next time. Thanks so much.